The month was November, in the year 1873. A wind that carried the hard promise of iron was coming down from the northern peaks. Elspeth and Maeve stood before their uncle's cabin, the door shut against them. They were 20 years old, identical in every line and plane of their faces, and they stood with a stillness that was its own kind of storm. Each held a single flour sack. In Maeve's, a small tin of seeds, saved from the summer garden, rattled faintly. In Elspeth's, there were 2 books, a tattered almanac and a geological survey of the county. The wind did not care about books. It pressed through the thin wool of their coats, a physical weight-seeking bone. Their uncle, Silas, had stood in the doorway, his face a mask of tired resolve. He looked from one sister to the other, at the silent conversation that always seemed to pass between them. "The world has no place for 2 halves of the same soul," he had said. "Go find one." The heavy wooden door had closed. The iron latch had clicked home. In Elspeth's sack, beside the books, was a hand-drawn map, folded into a perfect square. It showed a series of limestone formations on the far side of the ridge, marked with a single, cryptic word, breath. Where are you watching from tonight? Let us know in the comments below. Elspeth and Maeve were orphans. A fever had taken their parents 10 years prior, leaving them in the care of their mother's brother, a man who had accepted them with the same grim sense of duty he applied to mending a fence or clearing a stump. They were family. The obligation was clear. But from the beginning, they were different. They did not play with the other children of Promise Creek. They did not gossip or sing or seek the company of others. They worked. But their work was a strange and unsettling performance. They moved in a silent, seamless tandem. One would begin to weed a row of beans, and the other would arrive with the water bucket at the precise moment the first was finished. Maeve might reach for a hoe, only to find Elspeth's hand already offering it. No words were exchanged. There was only a shared current of intention, a unity of thought that made the townsfolk uneasy. It was not natural. Their minds were as synchronized as their bodies. They had no interest in the novels and poetry that the preacher's wife sometimes offered. Instead, they consumed information. They read agricultural pamphlets traded at the general store, memorizing tables of crop yields and soil compositions. They found a geological survey left behind by a student from the East, and from its dry, academic prose, they learned the language of the rocks, limestone, shale, granite, and the secrets each held. They studied old almanacs, not for the folk wisdom, but for the patterns. They charted moon phases against first frosts, rainfall against the migration of birds. They did not see a world of divine mystery or random chance. They saw a system of interlocking parts. A machine to be understood. They would spend entire afternoons not working, but watching. They observed the way water flowed across the homestead after a storm, noting where it eddied and pooled, where it ran fast and clear, and where it soaked deep into the earth. This was not idleness to them. It was a form of study, more vital than any sermon. The community of Promise Creek had no category for them. Twins were a curiosity, but these 2 were a puzzle that bordered on an affront. Their quiet, shared competence felt like a judgment. Their identical grey eyes seemed to look through people, to assess the world with a cool detachment that was mistaken for a lack of feeling. The people of the valley were loud and flawed and messy. They relied on each other's mistakes and forgiveness to feel human. Elspeth and Maeve made no mistakes. They asked for no forgiveness. They were a closed system, a perfect, 2-person society that needed nothing from the outside world. This self-sufficiency was not admired. It was feared. It was a silence that felt louder than a shout. The preacher, Reverend Miller, a man who believed God spoke most clearly in the predictable turning of the seasons, found their quiet innovations unnerving. After a Sunday service, he had pulled Silas aside, his face etched with a sincere, paternal concern. "A quiet woman is a blessing, Silas," he had said, his voice low. "But 2 quiet women who think the same thought at the same time, that is a silence that argues with God." His words gave a holy weight to the town's suspicion. It was not just that the girls were strange. Their strangeness was a form of blasphemy. The final break came in the autumn. Using salvaged lumber and old scraps of oiled canvas, the sisters had constructed a cold frame against the south-facing wall of the smokehouse. Applying principles they had read about in a French farming guide, they had managed to cultivate a small, thriving patch of winter greens. Long after the first hard frost had killed every other garden in the valley, their small plot remained defiantly green. This small, improbable harvest should have been a cause for celebration. Instead, it was treated as the final piece of evidence. It was uncanny. It was unnatural. It confirmed what everyone had suspected all along. Their knowledge was not of this world. So when the first blizzard of the season began to gather in the mountains, a palpable sense of purpose settled over Promise Creek. It was an opportunity. Silas, a man worn thin by years of poor harvests and the constant, unspoken pressure of his neighbor's judgment, finally broke. He chose the comfort of belonging over the burden of obligation. He chose his community over his kin. He did not rage. He did not shout. He simply handed them 2 flour sacks, each containing a small portion of dried meat and a heel of bread. He pointed them toward the mountain pass, a route he knew would be choked with snow by morning. He was not sending them on a journey. He was delivering a verdict. The wind was a physical thing. It did not howl. It pressed. The snow did not fall in gentle flakes, it was a horizontal blast of ice crystals that scoured their exposed skin. Their thin wool coats, adequate for a crisp autumn day, were useless against this assault. The cold was an invasive presence, finding every seam, every gap in the weave, and pouring through. It numbed their faces first, stealing the feeling from their cheeks and lips until their mouths felt like foreign objects. Then it went for their hands. Maeve, carrying the sack with the precious seeds, felt her fingers progress through the stages of freezing. First, a deep, burning ache. Then, a pins and needles torment. Finally, a profound and terrifying numbness, a deadness that spread up from the tips. She could no longer feel the rough texture of the burlap sack she clutched. She only knew she was holding it because her arm was bent. Elspeth walked in front, her head down, navigating not by sight but by memory. For years, on their forbidden walks, she had been mapping this terrain in her mind. She knew the angle of this slope, the shape of the ridge line against the darkening sky, the feel of the ground beneath her worn boots. They walked for hours, a silent, 2-person column against the fury of the storm. Then the shivering began. It started as a tremor in their legs and backs, a sign that their bodies were still fighting, still generating heat in a desperate, last-ditch effort. But the fight was costly. The relentless, violent contractions of their muscles drained what little energy they had. Their teeth chattered with a force that made their jaws ache. Every step was a negotiation with exhaustion. They found a shallow overhang of rock, a small recess that offered a brief respite from the direct onslaught of the wind. They crawled inside, huddling together, sharing the fading warmth of their bodies. Here, out of the wind, the shivering began to subside. Elspeth knew this was not a good sign. It was a symptom of surrender. The body, running out of fuel, was beginning to shut down. In the grey, roaring twilight, Maeve's voice was a dry whisper, barely audible over the storm. "We could go back," she said. Her words were cracked, her breathing shallow. "Apologize." Elspeth did not answer immediately. She stared out at the swirling chaos of white, but she was seeing something else. She saw the interior of her uncle's cabin, the meager meals of thin oatmeal, the way his eyes would always slide past them, never quite landing, as if they were ghosts in his home. She saw the faces of the townswomen in the general store, the way their conversations would halt, their smiles freezing on their faces, when the 2 sisters entered. She felt the accumulated weight of 1,000 small dismissals, 1,000 moments of being looked through. "Apologize for what?" she finally asked, her own voice rough with cold. The silence that followed was a complete and final answer. There was nothing to go back to. There was no apology that would make them fit. Lying there on the frozen stone, the cold seeping into her back, a profound weariness settled over Maeve. She closed her eyes. This is it, she thought. This is the end of the story. The strange sisters, frozen on the mountain. A cautionary tale for the children of Promise Creek. A neat and tidy ending. But Elspeth's mind, even as her body was failing, was not on surrender. It was working on a problem. The map in her sack. The geology book. A phrase from its pages surfaced in her memory, a string of dry, academic words that now felt like a prayer. Limestone formations in this region are often characterized by extensive cave systems, warmed by geothermal proximity to geothermal proximity. A promise not of a miracle, but of a specific, measurable phenomenon. It was a scientific fact, and in that moment, a fact was more useful than hope. Her body moved before her conscious mind had fully committed. It was a primal, animal instinct to survive. She pushed Maeve, a weak but insistent shove. Get up, the words were torn from her throat. We are not dying here. The simple, practical problem of standing, of forcing frozen limbs to obey, was enough to banish the seductive peace of giving up. They had a destination. They had a reason to take the next step. They stumbled on, following the map that existed more clearly in Elspeth's head than on the paper in her sack. It did not lead them up toward the pass, but down, into a small, winding ravine that was sheltered from the worst of the wind. Here, the snow was deeper, but the air was still. They moved through a landscape of ghostly, snow-laden junipers. And then she saw it. At the base of a sheer limestone cliff, partially obscured by the low, sweeping branches of an ancient tree, was a dark opening. A shadow against the grey rock. It was not a grand entrance. It was a crack, a flaw in the stone, no taller than a man. It was exactly as she had sketched it from a distance weeks before. The air at the mouth of the cave was not warm. But it was still. It did not move. And it carried a different smell. Not the sterile scent of ice and wind, but the rich, damp aroma of wet earth, of stone, of a place that had been sealed away from the world. They stepped across the threshold, out of the storm and into the profound silence of the earth. The cave was not a small hollow. It was a vast, sloping passage that led deep into the mountain. They walked cautiously, their eyes adjusting to the deep gloom. 50 yards in, then 100. With every step, the feeling of the air changed. The biting chill in their bones began to recede. They could feel their fingers and toes again, a sensation that was at first a new kind of agony, 1,000 sharp needles, but an agony that meant life. The passage opened into a massive central chamber, a natural cathedral of stone the size of a large barn. High above them, a wide fissure in the rock opened to the sky. Through it, they could see a column of swirling grey light and falling snow. But the snow was not reaching the floor. It melted in the air, turning to a fine mist that disappeared before it touched the ground. They stood in the center of the chamber, looking up at this impossible phenomenon. They looked at each other, their identical faces streaked with grime and frozen tears. They did not smile. They did not weep. The moment was too large for any simple expression. Maeve let her flour sack fall to the floor with a soft thud. She knelt, pulled off her thin glove, and placed her bare hand flat against the stone beneath her feet. It was cool to the touch, but it was not frozen. It felt like the earth of a cellar in the middle of summer. A deep, persistent, living coolness. She looked up at Elspeth. In her sister's eyes, she saw not relief, but recognition. They had not stumbled into a shelter. They had arrived at a destination. This was the place the world had no room for. This was home. The first week was a blur of urgent, calculated activity. Survival was the only text. They explored the network of passages leading from the main chamber, their steps echoing in the immense silence. In one of the lower tunnels, they found it, a slow, steady stream of water, filtering directly through the limestone walls and pooling in a shallow, stone-carved basin. They drank deeply. The water was clean and carried the faint, mineral taste of the mountain's heart. Crucially, it was not frozen. This was their water. This was life. They ate the last of their dried meat and the heel of hard bread, rationing every bite. Then, the real work began. They needed a home within a home, a shelter to protect them from the damp chill of the cave itself. The hidden valley outside the cave's mouth was a treasure trove of fallen timber, perfectly seasoned by years of sun and wind. They had no saw, no axe. Their only tools were the sharp, flat edges of shale they broke from the cavern walls. Laboriously, painstakingly, they would score a deep line around a log, then heave it against a rock outcropping until it snapped. It was brutal, exhausting work. They dragged the logs into the main chamber, their muscles screaming in protest. They had no nails, no iron spikes. They used a technique they had only read about, a system of notching the logs so they would interlock, fitting together like the pieces of a massive, rugged puzzle. They built their cabin directly beneath the fissure in the ceiling, the one place that received natural light. The cave was their shield against the blizzard, the small, sturdy cabin would be their shield against the cave. For a chimney, they found a natural vent in the rock face behind their chosen spot, a narrow flue that twisted its way up to the surface. They lined its base with wet clay from the stream bed, shaping a hearth and a firebox. This became the heart of their new world. Into the back wall of the cabin, they built a stone oven. It was a slow, deliberate process of selecting, lifting, and fitting rocks of all shapes and sizes, using the clay as a mortar. Their only tools were those shale blades, their own raw strength, and the silent, perfect coordination that had so unsettled the outside world. Here, in the heart of the mountain, it was their greatest asset. But their most precious cargo, the one they had guarded more closely than their own lives, was the small tin of seeds. In one of the lower chambers, far from the entrance, the geothermal effect was at its most pronounced. The air was still and humid, and the temperature, they guessed, held at a constant, cool 50 degrees. It was a natural root cellar, a subterranean greenhouse. Over several days, they hauled soil from the valley floor into this chamber, bucketful by bucketful. It was rich, black earth, and they mixed it with back guano they scraped from high, inaccessible ledges, a potent, natural fertilizer. They built shallow troughs from leftover scraps of wood and filled them with this custom-blended soil. With the care of surgeons, they planted their seeds, lettuce, radishes, carrots, hardy greens that could tolerate the cool and the low light. Weeks passed. Life fell into a rhythm dictated by work and darkness. In the dim, ethereal light that filtered down from the fissure, they watched their troughs. Then, it happened. A tiny, almost imperceptible spear of green broke through the dark soil. Then another, and another. It was a fragile, pale green, but it was life. It was an impossible, defiant statement in the dead of winter. In late January, when the valley of Promise Creek was buried under 4 feet of snow and the nightly temperature plunged to 20 below zero, Maeve harvested their first crop. She pulled a single radish from the soil. It was not large or vibrantly red like a summer radish. It was small and almost white. But it was firm, and it was perfect. She washed it in the cold, clear water of the stream and carried it back to the cabin. She handed it to Elspeth. They did not speak. They split it in half. The sharp, peppery snap of it in the deep silence of the cave was a sound louder and more profound than a cannon shot. It was the sound of proof. They had not merely survived. They had bent the rules of the world. They had created. With a small amount of flour they had brought, and a sourdough starter Maeve had kept alive in a small cloth, nestled against her body for warmth during their journey, they baked their first loaf of bread. The stone oven drew perfectly. The smell of baking bread, that most fundamental scent of civilization and home, filled their small cabin, then drifted out to fill the entire cavern. It was a smell that had no place in this world of ice and stone, and yet, here it was. It was the smell of their new-made world. Their supplies, however, were finite. They needed more flour, salt, oil. They were surviving, but they were not yet secure. One afternoon, a shadow fell across the cabin door. A figure stood at the entrance to the main chamber, silhouetted against the bright snow outside. It was Thomas, a boy from the town, barely 16 years old. The people of Promise Creek said he was simple. Slow. He rarely spoke and spent most of his time in the woods, running a small trap line. He had been tracking a snowshoe hare when he stumbled upon the hidden valley and the strange, dark mouth of the cave. He was not frightened by what he found. He saw the small cabin, the wisps of smoke from the chimney, the neat stacks of firewood. He saw their impossible garden in the lower chamber, its pale greens glowing in the lantern light. He saw it not as witchcraft, but as an elegant solution to a difficult problem. Thomas was a reader of the land. He could not decipher the words in their books, but he understood the language of their work. They offered him a piece of their bread. He ate it slowly, his eyes wide. He recognized in their quiet, focused competence a quality he himself possessed. He began to trade with them. A brace of hares for a bunch of radishes. A cured beaver pelt for a small loaf of bread. He became their bridge to the world they had left behind. He would take their furs on the long, 2-day journey to the next town over, a place where they were not known, and trade them for flour, salt, lamp oil, and more seeds. He never asked questions. He saw what they were doing, and he understood it was important. Thomas, the boy the community had dismissed as useless, became the linchpin of their survival. He did not keep their existence a complete secret. He couldn't. He brought a loaf of their bread, still faintly warm, to Mr. Henderson, the owner of the general store in Promise Creek. Henderson, a man whose face was a permanent mask of weary skepticism, scoffed at the story. Fresh bread, in the middle of the great blizzard that had sealed them off from the world for 2 months. Impossible. But the smell was undeniable. He took a piece. He had been eating nothing but salted pork and hardtack for weeks. His wife was sick with a lung ailment. His children were pale and thin. The taste of the dense, moist, real bread was a revelation. He sent Thomas back into the storm with a heavy bag of flour from his own dwindling stock. "Ask them," he said, his voice gruff to hide the desperation, "what they'll take for 2 more loaves." From his pulpit, Reverend Miller warned his flock about the temptations of unnatural harvests, of food that came from the dark places of the earth. He spoke of miracles that came from God, and those that came from other sources. But his words were a thin soup against the gnawing hunger in his parishioners' bellies. The blizzard did not break. The sickness spread. One by one, then in small, shamefaced groups, the people of Promise Creek began sending requests with Thomas. A family with a feverish child needed carrots for a broth. A young woman who had just given birth needed something, anything, besides salted meat to make her milk. They sent what little they had to trade, a sack of beans, a few pounds of sugar, a precious bag of salt. And in return, Thomas would emerge from the woods a day later, his sled laden with loaves of dark, fragrant bread, with bunches of pale, crisp lettuce, with sharp radishes and earthy carrots. They never saw the sisters. They did not want to. It was easier to accept the food if they did not have to look into the faces of the women they had cast out. It was a transaction, not a reconciliation. They came for the product, not the producers. Hunger had stripped them of their principles and left them with a raw and urgent pragmatism. The town of Promise Creek, which had sought to purge itself of the strange sisters, was now being kept alive by them. From the mountain, there was no judgment, no gloating, no "I told you so," there was only bread. Late February arrived, and with it, a change in the wind. The relentless blizzard finally broke, replaced by a still, piercing cold under a brilliant, unforgiving sun. But the mountain passes were choked with 20-foot drifts. The town remained an island, cut off from the world. Their relief at the storm's end was short-lived, replaced by the grim reality of their situation. The town's collective food stores were gone. What was left was being hoarded. A wasting flu had swept through the valley, leaving half the families too weak to haul firewood or melt snow for water. One morning, 2 figures made their way slowly up the hidden valley toward the cave. Thomas led the way, his steps sure on the packed snow. Behind him, a man struggled, his breath pluming in the frigid air. It was their uncle, Silas. He seemed to have shrunk. The man who had stood tall and righteous in his doorway now looked stooped and frail. The hard certainty that had defined him had collapsed inward, leaving his shoulders slumped. His face was gaunt, his beard a tangle of ice. The winter had scoured the pride from him, leaving behind something brittle and exhausted. He stopped at the entrance to the main chamber and simply stared. he saw the impossible made real, the sturdy cabin, the neat stacks of firewood, the distant, lantern-lit glow of the green garden. His world was one of predictable failure and hard limits. This place defied all of it. Elspeth and Maeve emerged from their cabin. They stood on their small porch, their faces calm, their hands still. They looked at the man who had sent them out to die. Silas would not meet their eyes. He looked at everything but them. Finally, his gaze fell, and he spoke to the ground. "The Miller family," he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "The Reverend. His wife. The children. All 4 of them are down with the fever. The baby is not going to last the day." Elspeth looked at Maeve. In that silent, shared glance, 1,000 things could have passed: triumph, vengeance, bitter satisfaction. But there was none of it. The past was a stone that had been dropped into a deep well. It was gone. A practical problem had been presented. A need had been stated. Elspeth turned her gaze back to Silas. Her voice, when she spoke, was level and calm, devoid of accusation. "How many more are sick?" It was a logistical question. It was the question of a quartermaster, not a victim. Maeve had already turned and gone back inside the cabin. She moved with quiet efficiency, wrapping 2 loaves of bread, still warm from the stone oven, in a clean linen cloth. She took down bunches of dried herbs from the rafters and measured them into a small sack. They did not require an apology. They did not ask for repentance. The demand for such things was a luxury for people who were not busy keeping the world alive. They were growers. They were bakers. They were builders. They saw a need, and they met it. It was the simplest, most fundamental rule of their existence. They sent Silas away with a sled laden with enough food to sustain 3 families for a week. Dense bread, a large pot of concentrated vegetable broth, and the sack of herbs that Thomas, with his woodsman's knowledge, knew how to brew into a tea to break a fever. As he was turning to leave, his shoulders still hunched in a permanent posture of defeat, Silas paused. He reached deep into his worn coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. Its cover was scuffed, its pages softened by years of handling. It was their mother's book of sketches. Inside were delicate drawings of wildflowers, of the shapes of clouds, of the faces of her 2 infant daughters. Silas had kept it all these years. He held it out, his hand trembling slightly from cold and weakness. He did not say, "I am sorry." He did not say, "I was wrong." He said, his voice thick, "This belongs with you." He placed the book in Elspeth's offered hand. His cold, rough fingers brushed against hers for a fleeting instant. It was the first time he had willingly touched either of them in a decade. Then he turned and followed Thomas back down the path, a man carrying a burden of bread and soup, leaving a debt behind him that could never be repaid in words. The book was the apology. It was the only one he knew how to give, and the only one they required. Maeve came and stood beside her sister on the porch, looking down at the familiar drawings in their mother's hand. She watched Silas's retreating figure grow smaller and smaller against the vast expanse of white. "He looks thin," Maeve said. It was not an accusation or a judgment. It was a simple, clinical observation. A fact. And in that small, quiet statement, there was a universe of forgiveness. To see him not as the monster who had condemned them, but as just another man, diminished and broken by a hard winter. The sisters of Promise Creek never moved back to the town. In a way, they never had to. The town came to them. When the great snows of 1873 finally melted, revealing a valley scarred by loss, people began to make the pilgrimage to the cave. They came not with accusations, but with offerings. Tools. A pair of milking goats. Chickens. Bolts of cloth. News from the outside world. They came to trade, but they also came to learn. The sisters taught them. They showed the women how to build cold frames that could extend the growing season by 2 months. They showed the men how to test the soil with simple ingredients and amend it with nutrients from the forest floor. They shared their knowledge of seed saving, of crop rotation, of how to read the land. They never preached. They never gave speeches. They simply showed the work, and let others learn by doing. They lived in that cave for another 60 years. The cabin was expanded, the gardens in the lower chambers grew to cover nearly an acre, and they built a small, clever mill by the underground stream to grind their own flour, powered by a water wheel of their own design. The cavern, once a silent, empty space, was filled with the sounds and smells of a thriving homestead, the bleating of goats, the scent of baking bread, the aroma of drying herbs. They died in the winter of 1934, within a week of each other, as quietly as they had lived. The mail carrier, concerned when they did not appear for their weekly trade, found them. They were sitting in two straight-back chairs on the small porch of their cabin, a single wool blanket drawn across both their laps. They were looking out toward the mouth of the cave, at the snow falling softly through the fissure in the rock above. Their faces were peaceful, serene. They looked like two women who had just finished reading a long and deeply satisfying book together, and had simply closed the cover. Their legacy was not written in books or recorded in official histories. It was etched into the land itself, and in the practices of the people who lived on it. Over their long lifetime, they had fed the town of Promise Creek through 7 different famines and hard winters. They taught 3 generations of farmers how to coax life from a harsh and unforgiving landscape. The specific techniques they developed, born of observation and necessity, are still used in that valley to this day. The townspeople buried them near the entrance to their home. Their headstone, carved from a single, large piece of limestone, bears no poetry, no scripture. It has only one short sentence. It does not say they were brave, or kind, or forgiving. It says, they fed the people. We all have a cave. A place inside us that the world has dismissed as strange, or quiet, or useless. A gift that doesn't fit into the categories people have made for it. You stand outside that door, perhaps you have for years, believing the voices that told you it was empty, that it was cold, that nothing could grow there. You've been told the world has no place for what you are. But what if the floor in that cave is warm? What if there's a spring of clean water you haven't found yet? What if the very thing they rejected you for is the seed of everything you are meant to build? That hand-drawn map in a flour sack was not an escape plan. It was a blueprint. The world will tell you what you are, the work is to find the place that agrees with you. If these stories of quiet resilience are what you look for, subscribe to our channel. Our next history is about a man who mapped the stars using a stolen atlas and a bucket of water.